We are going to hear from Philip James. He is giving The Elephant and the Serpent using Mastodon with Python. Please welcome Philip.
Hi, my name is Philip James. Welcome to The Elephant and the Serpent. This time slot is a slot of incredible talks, and I know you had to choose between myself, Lynn Root talking about async, Simon Willison talking about SQLite APIs, Jacob Kaplan talking about Django and Webpack, and a talk about Django channels. If any of those talks sound more interesting, feel free to go to one of them. I promise it'll be fine. If you decide to stick around, thanks. I really appreciate it. So this talk is going to be about Mastodon, an open source federated social network, and Python, the community wrapped around a programming language that brings us all here today. Before we get started, who am I? Like I said, my name is Philip James, and I lead the platform team at Patreon, who graciously support me being here. I've also given a number of talks at various PyCons across the globe, including a talk tomorrow with my frequent speaking buddy, Ashish Laroya. This slide here is from the talk we gave last year at PyCon titled All in the Timing. I speak about programming and technical topics all over the world because I still believe that programming is the closest I'll ever come to doing real magic. I've been programming professionally for over a decade, and I still find it somewhat magical to be able to create something useful out of bits and bytes and computers that we've tricked into thinking by shoving lightning into them. Now, some people in technology have trouble with the word magic. When I say magic, I mean something magical in its effect, not necessarily in its cause. The power that technology brings to the world is magical. The communities that technology help foster are magical. Even though we can explain every step that happens, every bit and byte and circuit, it is magical to the people who use it, and still magical to me. And while I wouldn't call myself an expert on the subject of magic, I know more about stage magic than most. That is my username across the vast majority of the internet, and I'd bet there are people in this room who have seen that name flit across their screen and didn't know who was on the other end until right now. Hello, I'm Fildini. But before Fildini was my internet handle, it was my stage name. I spent my early teenage years making pocket money by performing as the Great Fildini at birthday parties all over California. The feeling I got then, when I was able to pull off a trick, is very similar to the feeling I get now when making a piece of technology do what I want it to do. Of course, that string is also instantly recognizable as a Twitter username. Twitter is magic. The communities that Twitter fosters, communities that many of us in this room take part of on a daily basis, are magical. Through Twitter, we make connections that help us find work, chat with our peers, share our favorite activities, or sometimes even find love. Twitter is also magic from an engineering perspective. It operates on a scale that many of us in this room have trouble fathoming, and it mostly just works. The magic that exists in programming exists double in systems engineering, and large amounts of it are performed at Twitter on a regular basis. Twitter is also dark magic, magic that destroys rather than creating. It's a place where the most misguided amongst us feel free to express every negative opinion, where we are constantly inundated with reminders of violence, or targeted with violence ourselves, where it seems like the political bombs are always going off, and where it feels like we have to wade through toxic waste to get to the parts that we like. All of this happens in a set of systems that are currently using our data, our connections and thoughts and ideas to aggregate ourselves and sell us off to advertisers. And this is because there is a misalignment of incentives with large social networks that I think cannot be easily resolved. The people running those social networks want to make money for their work, which is completely fair. Most of the people using those social networks don't want to or can't pay for them, but do want a place to form communities with all their friends already live. There is still a mental model amongst internet users that the internet is free, and it's hard to blame them. We in the industry of making the internet haven't done enough to educate users otherwise. The piece of black magic that tries to bridge these incentives is advertising. I don't necessarily believe all advertising is inherently evil, but I do think the advertising at scale necessary to fund something like Twitter forces companies to make compromises that are hard to align with the average user's incentives, and which promote either a blind eye towards or willful encouragement of the dark magic I was talking about earlier. Towards the end of 2016, I was deeply despairing about all social networks, Twitter especially, and I thought we were never going to get anything better. I didn't think there was a way to build a global community online without funding it through ads. In early 2017, I discovered Mastodon. Mastodon is magic. Mastodon is an open source social networking platform based on a set of technologies that are being adopted as open standards for building social networks. Mastodon solves some of the problems of modern social networks by not having any single server. Instead, anyone can create a server, and that server can federate with any other server on the network. Imagine anyone could start their own Twitter server, and you could join that server, but follow and be followed by anyone on any other server. Because there's no central service trying to make money from this, there's no tracking of user data, no ads engine trying to collect data, and each user and server admin has control over what they see and who they interact with. Mastodon looks like this. This is the main Mastodon web interface. If you think it looks like an older era TweetDeck, you're not wrong. I know this text is small and there's a lot going on here. I'm going to try to explain what's going on column by column. Also, anywhere I've blurred things out, it's because I felt I didn't have permission to make them public to the world, even if they might have been public status updates. This is the main compose bar. Here you can access your account settings, search hashtags and users, and compose toots. The standard way to describe a status update in Mastodon is toot, mainly because that's what the button in the software says. We'll be using toot and status update pretty interchangeably in this talk. Default Mastodon lets users send 500-character updates. Users can, of course, include emoji in their toots, including per-server custom emoji that still get rendered correctly across all the servers. There's a robust community of creating and sharing custom emoji across servers. Toots can have polls, and you can set a visibility and content warning for each of your toots. A brief word on that. Content warnings deserve special mention. If you think your content, what you're trying to share with the world, needs a Twitter warning so that people can opt into seeing it, or is a spoiler for some pop media, like, say, Endgame of Gamer or Game of Thrones, you can hide it behind some text and users have to chew to see it rather than being confronted with it. Content warnings and toot visibility make an attempt to solve the problems outlined in this XKCD. You can set your toots to be public, unlisted, or followers only. Public is what it says on the tin. Unlisted is public, but it won't show up in the federated or local timelines. More on that in a minute. And followers only is exactly that. It is only available to your followers. Speaking of followers, this is the home column. This is all the toots from all the people you follow, no matter what server they're on. You can do all the things you might expect from a social network, like replying, boosting, and liking. The local timeline shown here is all the public non-reply toots from people on the same server as you. What's being talked about on the local timeline is one of the best ways to judge the community you've joined on the local server. Here we can also see an example of marking images with a content warning. The user has to choose to see this image, and therefore gets to choose what they want to be confronted with in their social media. The federated timeline is one of the most interesting things about Mastodon, and we're going to talk more about it in a minute. This timeline is all the public toots your server knows about. If it gets federated to your server and its public visibility, it'll end up here. And it's an incredible way to discover new people to follow and see what the Fediverse as a whole is talking about. I've said the word federation a lot, but I haven't really explained it. To give us all a grasp of what's going on, I'm going to talk about one of the open protocols that powers Mastodon. Mastodon is powered by a technology called ActivityPub, which is currently a recommendation to the W3C. ActivityPub is a decentralized social networking protocol, and it powers the vast majority of the universe of federated social networking sites, collectively known as the Fediverse. ActivityPub specifies two main pieces, a server-to-server federation protocol and a client-to-server protocol. To understand Mastodon under the hood, you need to understand ActivityPub. And I'm going to explain ActivityPub with two of the most famous users in computing history, Alice and Bob. This is Alice. Alice is a user, what ActivityPub calls an actor. Alice, according to ActivityPub, has an inbox and an outbox. The inbox receives messages from the rest of the world, and the outbox is where Alice puts the messages she wants to send to the rest of the world. Alice's inbox and outbox live in a server, in this case, mastodon.social. Alice's full username in the Fediverse is @alice@mastodon.social. Her client makes API requests against the server to take actions, like getting new messages from the inbox and posting messages she wants to send to her outbox. This is the client-to-server protocol. If Alice wants to send a message to Bob at mastodon.social, she posts a message to her outbox, which mastodon.social posts to Bob's inbox, which Bob then gets with his client and reads. If it feels like email, it is, deliberately so. If Bob is on a completely different server, this works mostly the same way. Mastodon.social knows how to look up Bob on a different server, and Mastodon.social will post the message to Bob at other servers' inbox. This is the server-to-server protocol of part of ActivityPub, and in many ways it really is that simple. I'm simplifying somewhat, but not that much. This server-to-server protocol is the beating heart of federation. Every user has a home server, and all the servers know how to talk to each other by posting to the right inboxes for the right users. Those of you who have worked with networks probably already understand this, but one of the benefits of federation like this is resiliency to any one node in the network going down. This has in fact happened in the past to the largest English-speaking server, Mastodon.social. Mastodon.social has gone hard down for hours, and the rest of the network of servers kind of didn't notice. They kept sharing messages and kept the network alive. When Mastodon.social came back up, the other servers attempted to replay messages back to the right users' inboxes, and the Fediverse rolled merrily along. Now, yes, messages can get dropped, but the software is smart enough to try really hard not to let that happen. This idea also applies to server-to-server moderation. If one server in the Fediverse decides to become a hotbed for trolls or Nazis, the admins of the other servers can choose to blacklist that node and prevent that garbage from entering their users' feeds. I want to say another word here about the magic of communities. Magical communities require community norms. In the modern parlance, this means that communities we belong to have codes of conduct, rules for how we should behave, and procedures that get followed if we break those rules. It's interesting to note, from my perspective, that it's only with the rise of sites like Twitter and Facebook that this has been seen as hotly contested or strange. When I joined the internet back in the days of IRC and web forums, the admins and operators of those spaces had the power to enforce community norms through silencing and banning. Often this was at the whims of the admin, and I would argue that explicit codes of conduct make this better by making it clear what is expected of the admins as well as the community members. One of the cool things about Mastodon is that admins on servers can mute or block entire remote servers and people on remote servers from interacting with the users of their server. An admin can enforce what happens on their server, even if the users involved are on a remote server. This helps make magical communities. Admins can work with the users they're supporting to make sure the place they're building together is what everyone is looking for in an internet home. Okay, so we have message sending, we have a federated network of servers, but we're not quite a social network yet. To power a true social network, we need one more thing, the ability to follow others and be followed. ActivityPub has a solution for this, a follower and following collection. Let's explain with an example. Bob wants to follow Alice. He, via his server, posts a follow action to Alice's inbox. Alice's server receives the message and adds Bob to Alice's follower collection. Now, that's supposed to say Bob, not Ben. I have no idea why it says Ben. Now, when Alice posts a message to her followers, Bob is on that list, and Alice's server will post the message to Bob's inbox. Congrats! You now know most of what you need to know to understand how Mastodon and the whole Fediverse operate and how all the servers connect to each other. If you're interested in learning more, definitely check out the ActivityPub Rocks site and read the W3C spec. It's pretty straightforward. It's deliberately a simple protocol with a lot of power, and beyond powering Twitter-like sites like Mastodon, the open source community is building alternatives to YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and many more off the ActivityPub protocol. And the cool thing is, because they all speak that protocol, it's like you can follow someone on YouTube from your Twitter account, or follow someone on Instagram from your YouTube account, because they all speak the same protocol. Because there is no central server, every Mastodon server is a complete set of Mastodon API endpoints. The Mastodon API lets you basically do everything the Mastodon web interface lets you do via the API. These two bots here use the Mastodon API and special characters in the Unicode set to make aquariums and space scenes. Bot accounts aren't frowned upon in the network, and there are options in the account settings on Mastodon to mark an account as a bot account. There are even some servers that are specifically bot-friendly. Botsin.space hosts some pretty neat art bots that are using the Mastodon API on that server to make the whole Fediverse more interesting. So let's prove this by building a bot. What's our bot going to do? It's going to toot random lines from the Zen of Python. It's going to live on that botsin.space server, since that server is so friendly to bots. The first thing we're going to need is an OAuth access token for an account on botsin.space. The Mastodon API uses OAuth authorization to make API requests against protected endpoints, like making status updates. And as a developer, you can choose the right scopes you need for the applications or bots you're developing. Fully explaining OAuth is sadly outside the scope of this talk, but I'm happy to chat about how OAuth works if you come find me afterwards. The Patreon API, which I work on, is also protected by OAuth, and I help maintain our OAuth integration, so I'd love to chat with people about how that works. But we still need an access token, so let's get one from botsin.space. Let's make sure the video is working. Yeah, we're going to start by going into our settings for our botsin.space account, clicking Development, and clicking New Application. Our application needs a name and a website, and some scopes to give us the right access. Since we're going to be the only ones using this app, the default scopes are fine. Once the app is created, we need the access token that's auto-generated for us. It's that long hex string that we're copying here. Note that there isn't really an approval process. Because every server hosts its own copy of the APIs, anyone can interact with the network and get kind of full access to the API. You just make apps on servers and start using them. With our access token, we can now make requests against the Mastodon API at bots.space. Whenever I'm building a bot, I like to test things in the Python shell first so I can play around and get a feel for what I'm doing. As we build our bot, we're going to do the same thing using the Python requests library. Let me just fire up a Python 3 shell real quick. I'm going to import requests in the Python shell. And then I'm going to make a post request against the bots.space statuses API with my OAuth access token and a data blob saying what I want the status text to be. The response came back OK, so I should have successfully posted to bots.space. And it turns out I did. I love using the request library when I'm playing with APIs because I get a feel for what goes into an API and what kind of responses come out. But when I'm ready to start building an app, I normally look for a client library for the API I want to use. It turns out there is a Python client library for Mastodon called mastodon.py. Mastodon.py is a community-maintained Python library for Mastodon that supports a large set of features in the Mastodon API. Let's do what we just did in requests in mastodon.py. So the first thing I'm going to do is pip install mastodon.py, open a Python 3 shell, import the correct class for mastodon.py, and then create an instance that I can use to interact with the API. Once I have my instance created, I should be able to use this to toot to bots.space using the Zenbot account. Cool. Now, in what I get back, I get a URL that should be the toot that I just created. So I'm going to use the Python web browser module in the standard library to open the URL directly that I just basically created by tooting at bots.space. Cool. And there's the toot. So after that, we have a toot posted to bots.space. Hooray! But you might be wondering why we would use a client library when requests works just as well. There's a few great reasons to use a client library that I can think of. You should use mastodon.py or any good client library because that library will almost certainly have tests for the functionality it provides, tests that you don't have to write for your requests-based code. Libraries like mastodon.py even provide coverage metrics for their tests so you can make better choices about how much you trust the library. The second reason to use a client library is it provides abstractions. A good client library will translate the response from the API into Python objects that are easier to use in the rest of your Python code, i.e. translating a JSON response into a Python object. As a result of those abstractions, when the API changes and the library updates with the changes, often you as the developer don't need to worry about it because the abstraction the library provides hasn't changed. So why shouldn't we use a client library? Either because we have special functionality that isn't provided by the library that we want in our app, or we're really worried about lag between the API updating and the library updating. I would say in both those cases, consider committing a patch or diff to the library before rolling your own. If the patch is accepted, you get all the benefits of using a library and your special case is covered. OK, we have an access token. We know how to post toots. Now we need to wire the Zen of Python into our bot. We need to get the Zen of Python as strings, randomly choose one of those strings, and put that string into a toot for our bot. So again, we're going to start a Python shell, import the Zen of Python by doing import this, assign a variable called Zen to the split string of the printed out Zen of Python. It prints with a bunch of new line characters that we want to split on so that we get the right strings. It looks like we've got some decent strings. Then we're going to import the random library after importing Mastodon and web browser and try to choose some of those strings at random to make sure that we're actually getting what we want out of the output. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so it looks like we're correctly choosing strings that can go into our Zen of Python bot. We're going to create an instance of the Mastodon API like we did previously to post the toot, and then compose a toot using one of the random strings that we chose. One of the nice things about the Mastodon client library is that you can specify an API base URL and potentially use multiple base URLs if you are maintaining multiple clients for like a larger scale application, instead of having to hard code that every time you want to use it with requests. So our toot's going to say the Zen of Python says, and then some new lines, and then use the magic of f strings to do random.choice on the Zen string. We'll toot that, and then open the result in the web browser so that we can see it again. Cool, it got a little cut off, but there we go. We have created a little Zen bot that's tooting strings from the Zen of Python. This is the full script that I would be running if I wanted to have this running in the background. We don't the import random got cut off at the top, and I'm using os.getEnv because I want the access token not to necessarily live in the script in case I check it into GitHub. I want it to be an environment variable that I can set somewhere else. But it's deliberately a pretty simple script because writing bots should be kind of a fun and simple activity. Another thing that I could do with the Mastodon API through mastodon.py is look for replies to my bot and then respond to those replies or modulate my responses based on the replies. Okay, so now that we have our bot, where do we host it? Lots of places are options. If you only want it to run when your laptop is open, you can have it running in the background on your laptop with cron. That works for Mac and Linux. For Windows, you can use some Windows scheduling daemon things, but that's a little bit more complicated. If you have a server just laying around that you own, again, you can use that server in cron. My actual favorite way to host bots is to use Heroku plus the Heroku scheduler to run just a worker dyno with the bot script on some sort of regular interval. Because with Heroku, you don't need to be running a web application. It can run kind of background tasks just fine. OK, all of that covered. How do you choose a server to be on? Hopefully by this point I've convinced you to at least give Mastodon a try. How do you know where you should be? The first thing you should do is go to joinmastodon.org. And there's some considerations. Because you can follow more or less anyone on more or less any server, the choice of which server to set up your account on becomes one of which community you want to most closely associate with. Generally speaking, you should find servers where you feel like you could find a home, that have a good code of conduct, and where the admins feel like they're on top of things. For example, I run a server called The Wandering Shop that accepts all kinds of people, but is focused on people who enjoy or create science fiction and fantasy. If you want to learn more about that server, find me afterwards. Also, you can always try different servers out, have multiple identities, and ask your followers to follow you at a different server. Mastodon even provides some tools for making this easier. OK. That's basically it. So after this talk, what I want you to do is find a server, join the community, build a bot, and help make some magic. That top line there is my email address, phildini@phildini.net. I'm also at phildini@wandering.shop. And if you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at phildini. In this room tomorrow at 1:10, I'm going to be doing a talk with my co-presenter Ashish Laroya on account security best practices for Python web applications. And I think we do have a little bit of time for questions. Thanks. Oh, do I see someone with a question? Yeah, great. Step up to the mic. I will say your question needs to be in the form of a question. If you have something that's not a question, come find me afterwards.
OK, so there are a lot of social media networks. How do you recommend that we get people involved necessarily in Mastodon or prying their Twitter out of their cold den hands?
So Mastodon has some tools for helping with this, including a Twitter kind of like user follower where you can like log in with your Twitter account and see which of your friends kind of already have Mastodon accounts. So that's one way to kind of like encourage people to start porting things over. There also are Twitter cross-posters going in both directions, so you can still kind of maintain a presence on both sites. In terms of like how do we start moving people over, I'll be honest, one of the reasons that I gave this talk is to show off Mastodon, to show how interesting and easy it is to make bots and kind of interact with it as programmers, but also to encourage people to start using it. I mean, there was a time when no one in this room used Twitter because either Twitter didn't exist or Twitter was still so new that it didn't feel like something that people wanted to use. And so I think it's one of those things where the more we build the network there, the easier it's going to be to convince people to kind of move to that network. And for me, it has kind of the best combination of kind of like old school IRC chat rooms and forums where it felt like a very tight community that like people had control over, but you still have access to kind of the whole universe if you want that. We'll switch, so we'll go to you.
In the Mastodon server that you help moderate, have you encountered some of the darker people who are doing some not so nice things on the internet, and how have you sort of managed that, and like what kind of overhead is associated with that?
So that's a great question. So I admin a server called The Wandering Shop that has about 1,500 users. And by the way, the Mastodon community as a whole, I think is getting close to 2 million total users. So it's not Twitter scale, but it's also not tiny. And a lot of those servers are English-speaking, but also there's a huge chunk that's French-speaking. There's a massive chunk that speaks Japanese. I think we have users in most countries at this point. In terms of my admin overhead, it's less than an hour a week, realistically speaking. Have I seen those darker corners of the internet? Yes, 100%. And there is kind of a community of administrators that kind of shares tips on like, hey, this server seems bad. One of the nice things is, because everyone on the server that I run has opted into the code of conduct, as an admin, I feel pretty okay just like whole-on blocking or banning servers that are like deliberately not following our code of conduct. Or like there are some that's like, there are some that are like deliberately, we are a server that is full of free speech for Nazis, and I'm like, well, that's an easy instant block. We never want to see any of you. Have a great life. And that's the kind of cool that you can do that. And so, the Wandering Shop has blocked probably a dozen servers, like hard block, like, nope, sorry, you're not going to be a good members of the community. You can still be part of the rest of the Fediverse, but you're not welcome here. And it's cool that you can do that. You can also do that as a per user basis, where you can, like, as a user say, I, as the user account, don't want to see anything from this server. Go away. And additionally, when you make a report on a toot, it goes both to your server admin and the admin of whatever server the account that made the toot is hosted on. So there's like kind of a community of moderation as well, which is pretty cool to see. And in fact, recently we just blocked, kind of the admin community just kind of blocked a server that was refusing to accept reports on their users. And we're like, if you're not going to follow safe reporting practices, you don't get to play in our sandbox. Hi.
Hello. This kind of compound question. First is, what is the kind of the age demographic for Mastodon use, or is that something that you're aware of? And the second is, do you remember FidoNet?
Do I remember FidoNet?
FidoNet.
Vaguely, not very well. The age demographics. One thing I forgot to mention, especially since people are starting to filter out, which is totally okay. I'm still impressed you all chose this talk. There is going to be a Mastodon open space at 3 p.m. in room. Check the board. In room, check the board. If you're interested in learning more about Mastodon, a couple people who are using the software are going to be there. So definitely go check that out. Average age demographics. It runs the gamut. I would say that the average age of a Mastodon user is probably, let's just call it millennial. But I've seen literally the gamut. There is, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I remember FidoNet. But my question is, would you speak a half a second or so about standing up a Mastodon server?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's three main ways to do it right now. One is there are a lot of hosting providers that are providing Mastodon packages. Like I think DigitalOcean now has a built-in droplet for it, which is like click button, receive Mastodon. There's also a site called masto.host, which is like, this is what we do as a, like Mastodon as a service almost, where you can like stand up your own Mastodon server and pay them like 20 bucks a month. It's like, here you go, have a Mastodon server. There's two if you really want to get into it, and actually those services didn't exist when I was spinning up the Wandering Shop. So the way that I do it is I have a DigitalOcean server that's running the Mastodon Docker Compose configuration, because there is a Docker Compose configuration and Docker images that are maintained by the project. And then there's a like I am committed to systems administration way to run like the application with the full Nginx config and like maintaining your own Postgres and that kind of thing. But I am a very lazy systems administrator, and so Docker Compose.
Thanks.
Yep. Hi.
Thank you for the talk, and I think everybody's a lazy system admin. It's part of the job. My question was, you talked about this being sort of similar to IRC, where you can get to everything. Do you see it as a replacement for IRC, especially given that Mozilla is saying, okay, we can't support this anymore. We can't use it as our internal communications. Do you see this as being a real-time communication platform? Do you see it as being a sort of offline social network? How do you see this filling in that space?
That's a great question. I would call it closer to a social network, but not a real-time communication platform. And ActivityPub, if you're willing to poll a whole bunch, it can work in real time, but ActivityPub isn't necessarily designed for real-time communication. It's designed for status updates and all of the possible things you can fit in a status update, like a follow request or like a media request or like a posting a video. The thing that I haven't seen anybody build yet that I'm really looking forward to is some sort of like events solution off of ActivityPub. What? So I don't think it's designed for real time. Right. In terms of like what's out there for real time in the open source space right now, I mean, there's going to be a ton of competing solutions. Probably the closest that we have to a real like true end-to-end open source viable alternative to like modern proprietary chat systems is Matrix, quite honestly. They've been in the news a lot recently for some unfortunate reasons, but I still think that they are probably like the best shot at a full end-to-end open source chat solution that is like can speak to all the protocols and like still has a nice user interface and all that kind of stuff.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the talk.
Also Zulip. Yeah, thank you. Last question.
Hi, thanks again for the talk. Kind of a quick question for you. It's like, why do you still use Twitter while continuing to use Mastodon?
For exactly related to the first question that was asked, I still use Twitter because like most of my friends, especially my friends in tech, are still primarily posting to Twitter, right? Like as soon as I can get a critical mass of my friends to use Mastodon, and trust me, I encourage them on a regular basis to do so, I will happily turn off my Twitter account. The thing that I have done, which makes Twitter amazingly better, and there's even a little glitch app that you can Google for that will kind of auto-do this for all your followers. Turn off retweets. It turns out that the content that the people you follow are posting directly is often incredible content, and all of the stuff that gets retweeted is like rage bait. So honestly, turning off Twitter has made Twitter a much better user experience in terms of like my happiness with the platform. But it still has some of the like dark magic that I talked about at the beginning in terms of being ads funded and what it allows and doesn't allow on the platform. But the reality is like here, if I were to search for the PyCon 2019 hashtag on Mastodon, it wouldn't be anywhere near the volume of searching for the PyCon 2019 hashtag on Twitter, right? And so while I would love for everybody to move, I also don't think it's reasonable to ask people to cut themselves off from the conversation. We should still have the conversation in the place where the conversation is, but we should be encouraging people to kind of like evaluate their social media choices and maybe move to a platform that has better community ideals.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. I think I'm going to call it there. Have a great rest of your PyCon and maybe see you tomorrow.